Hi, I'm Andrew Kane, politics editor of the Richmond Times-Dispatch. The General Assembly returns to Richmond tomorrow for a 46-day session, and we're here with some of the politics reporters from our team to preview what's going to happen and what's at stake. With me are Charlotte Renee Woods, Dave Ress, and Anna Bryson. So we'll start off with Charlotte. One of the key issues that folks are talking about is the prospect of abortion legislation since the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. What can we expect in the session?
Well, as the House Speaker said yesterday, we won't be able to expect too much to happen this session, but it's all sort of a preamble for next session. Right now, with the issue falls largely along partisan lines, with Democrats having control of the Senate and Republicans having control of the House. Anything, restrictions or bans that happen to clear the House would be, pretty much squashed in the Senate. There's also the special election with Senate District 7, which if Aaron Rouse wins that, he's bolstering the Democratic lead in the Senate. But we're still seeing bills being filed because legislators are really trying to show voters, where they fall on this issue, because by next year, 2024, that's where we're really going to see, efforts for 15-week bans or restrictions. We're going to see some, debates on, life at conception versus how long is it, a clump of cells, when can a fetus feel pain? That's where we're going to start to see all of those debates play out.
Governor Youngkin said after the Supreme Court overturned Roe that he was going to seek a ban of most abortions after 15 weeks, with exceptions for rape, incest, or for the life of the mother. But there could be a fallback attempt at 20 weeks, but that probably isn't likely to pass.
Yeah, it's definitely, there will continue to be chatter this session, but unlikely that anything will pass this session. But again, 2024 session is where we'll start to see movement, whether that's protecting access to the procedure or walking in some restrictions or some bans to the procedure.
And Charlotte alluded to an important special election that's going to occur this evening. There's a special election down in Virginia Beach for the seat of Jen Kiggins. She's the Republican state senator from Virginia Beach who was elected to Congress on November 2nd. And so Aaron Rouse, the Democrat, and Kevin Adams, the Republican, are vying for that seat. If Democrats pick it up, their edge in the Senate goes to 22-18, which makes further curbs on abortion probably even less likely. So let's talk about some of the governor's other priorities for this session. Dave, after securing $4 billion in tax cuts in 2022, Governor Youngkin's going to seek more in this session.
He's going to seek about $1 billion worth of additional tax cuts, and that's going to probably be one of the central divisions in the General Assembly this year. The governor feels Virginia is really flush with cash. He's got projections going forward that talk about $3.5 billion of the surplus this year, rising in about 5 years to $11 billion. So he says Virginia can afford the tax cuts. Democrats, who remember are a Senate majority and control the Senate Finance Committee, are pretty adamant that Virginia needs to spend some money for underfunded things from the past. They cite in particular education and mental health. What
types of tax cuts are the governor seeking this time around?
Well, the popular one is individual income tax. So he wants to roll back the top rate, which remember in Virginia starts like 17 grand, to 5.5% from 5.75%. He wants to bump up the standard deduction, which is probably where the real muscle in tax saving comes, to $9,000 for single, $18,000 for joint. And here's where I think the most resistance is going to come, and he's going to have a really hard time doing it, is he wants to cut the corporate income tax from 6% to 5%. He does a little sweetener as well for small businesses, a 10% tax credit for businesses that the owner basically pays the taxes on his individual in return.
Okay, and one of the governor's other priorities for this session is work on the mental health system, particularly behavioral health. Of course, everybody knows we had the back-to-back tragedies late last year with Virginia and at the Walmart in Chesapeake. Dave, what are some of the changes that the governor is going to seek to make to try to bolster the mental health system?
That's a really interesting one. Mental health has been something that's been kind of underfunded and gotten limited attention over the years. The governor wants to take about $230 million and direct it largely at what are called crisis services. It's going to be stuff like mobile teams to respond to people who are in a crisis and melting down. And crisis in Virginia means an imminent risk of hurting themselves or others. He wants to set up centers where people can go, and he wants to be sure there's more beds in hospitals for people to go to. This is something that Speaker Todd Gilbert is saying is something he expects there to be real bipartisan support on. Everyone agrees it's past time to do something about mental health in Virginia.
Okay, and that $230 million that you referred to, that's just the first year of the program.
Yeah.
So that would be continuing.
And of course, part of what's going to happen with the debate about taxes is going to be Democrats are going to be pushing and saying, we need to do more. Cree Deeds, the state senator from Bath, is already talking about, we need to start doing more stuff in the community, the more the preventive, more of the let's help people before they're in a crisis.
Right. And a lot of folks here will remember the tragedy with Marcus David Peters, who was killed in a mental health situation with a police officer. So there have been a number of efforts to try to help folks in a time of crisis before police get involved. So we'll keep an eye out on that. And one of the other priorities for Republicans in this session is going to be school choice. Tell us a little bit about what the Youngkin administration is seeking to do.
So there's a bill from Delegate Glenn Davis, a Republican, that would create education savings accounts, which are similar to voucher programs, but instead of the money going directly to private schools, it would go into a savings account for the parents to then spend on usually private school tuition. But it can also be spent for homeschool parents. They can spend on things like tutors, supplies, curriculum, things like that. It would come out of the state portion of per student funding, which varies differing on location. According to Davis, the average amount that parents would get is $6,000, but in places like Fairfax, where they have the formula says that the county has a higher ability to pay, the state portion would be a lot less, so those parents would get a lot less in that situation.
And there have been pushes for school choice in Virginia for a number of years when we've had Republican administrations. I know in the past they've tried to have a regional entity involved in getting approval for charter schools, but the governor has been taking sort of a different tack with sort of innovation, trying to get the colleges involved as well. So that's something we're probably going to see another push on. That's not the only area where we're going to see some hot button issues involving education. What else do you think we expect to arise in this session?
There are quite a few bills that have to do with the treatment of transgender students. There are a couple that have to do with sports, so they would require students to play on the team that correlates to their birth sex. So transgender girls couldn't play on the girls' team and vice versa. There's also one that would require a court order for schools to change the name of a kid. And there's another one that if a student told their teacher they were identifying as something other than their birth sex, the teacher would be required to call the student's parents. And given the divide in the legislature, it's not likely that these would pass, but it's still an indication that this is going to be a big topic.
I know another topic that folks are going to keep an eye on is how race is taught in schools. Folks will recall that last year when the governor was inaugurated, he put in an executive order to bar the teaching of what he termed divisive topics. Where are we as far as the K-12 history standards? There have been a couple iterations of that so far.
Yeah, so the most recent one came out on Friday. It was a sort of redo of the last one put out by the Youngkin administration that fixed some of the errors that were in the last one, including things about the last one called Native Americans America's First Immigrants. So they fixed that. They added in more things about some underrepresented communities who had criticized the last draft, but that will come up at the February 1st State Board of Education meeting. There's also an alternative draft put out by a separate group that will be considered by the board. That is a little bit more like the 2015 version, which is what we have now.
To help folks understand who has the final call here, the Youngkin administration has been formulating this latest iteration of the standards. Who has the final say? Is this implemented solely by the Youngkin administration, or is this done by the State Board of Education?
This State Board of Education has complete control over this. Despite the fact the Youngkin administration has been pretty involved with these drafts, it's totally under purview of the board.
Okay, very good. Dave, we talked a little bit about Governor Youngkin's priorities for the session. I know that you had a story recently talking about the state Democratic legislative leadership and some of their priorities. What are some of the things that they hope to arise in this session?
I think it's interesting because the Democrats, of course, were a majority until 2021, and while they were a majority, they passed some, for Virginia, truly astounding reforms on labor law in particular. One of them was minimum wage. That was, in order to get that through, even with general Democratic support, they had to phase it in, and the last two chunks, $13.50 for 2025 and $15 for 26, were subject to a vote this session. So you know that's going to be a fight. Republicans are not generally in favor of minimum wage. Democrat support can get a little squishy too. There are going to be things dealing with paid family leave. There'll be a carryover from last year. The Democrats, interestingly, are talking about things like legislation on affordable housing, which I haven't seen yet. And that's always a difficult one for the state to get involved with.
What do they want to do? They talk about trying to rein in costs, but how would a legislative body do that?
I think it would have to be, but again, I haven't seen this yet. You know, the governor has talked a lot about affordable housing being something you solve through regulation. And the regulation that really affects that, of course, is local regulation, zoning, that kind of thing, which the state can't really do anything about. The counter is likely to be, let's talk about funding through the state, through programs, you know, basically through things like the housing and community development, grants, loans, that kind of thing. Haven't seen it yet, so that may be a long shot.
It would require some synergy between local governments and state government for sure.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we all, well, actually, some of us are old enough to remember the car tax debate. The idea of the state telling local government what to do, what you can tax, which may come up again this session too, with the grocery tax, is always sort of fraught.
To briefly go into the Wayback Machine, Governor Jim Gilmore, Republican who served in the late 1990s, proposed doing away, or actually did do away with the car tax. This is the personal property tax that you pay on your vehicles, and this was particularly onerous in Northern Virginia, where the tax hit in November, right as kids were making their Christmas lists, and parents were sort of aggrieved at having to give this big check of $700-800 all right before Christmas. And so that was a popular initiative. It helped Gilmore get elected in 1997, but in order to try to make the localities whole, it created a big hole in the state budget. So there is wariness in the legislature about trying to get involved in localities, what they perceive as localities' prerogatives. So we'll see how that transpires here. Dave and Charlotte, another area of interest is the broad spectrum of climate and utilities issues. Let's start, Dave, talking about some of the interesting moves regarding regulation and rates for the utilities. What's going on there?
Well, I always think it wouldn't really be a Virginia legislative session if we weren't fighting over Dominion and its rates. The latest is really kind of interesting, though. For several years, probably going back to 2007 when we ended the deregulation, Dominion has pushed very successfully for looser oversight by the State Corporation Commission. This year, as the political will generally among legislators has grown for doing something to rein in electric bills and to enhance the authority of the State Corporation Commission over rates, there are bills that have been introduced. But interestingly, Dominion is introducing a bill that in elements of it would increase State Corporation Commission control over rates. The effect could be really kind of interesting. One part of it would deal with what are called base rates and could give the Commission some authority to push these down. They've been locked since basically 2007. If you're interested for what people say is the typical residential bill for 1,000 kilowatt hours, base rates are about $70. The wild card is what's going to happen with something, with basically a bunch of surcharges. There's 24 of these. They call them riders, racks, the usual acronym. The Dominion bill would start bringing these into base rates, and the effect of that on what your rate would be is hard to tell right now.
And there's particular interest in the rates right now because we have a giant offshore wind project from Dominion that is the largest in the country and would be one of the largest in the world. And that's also having an effect on what all of us ratepayers pay. So it seems like there's something of a consensus building that there needs to be sort of a return to some sort of oversight of this sort of regulatory posture. Have you seen that as well?
Yeah, because then, the SEC, when they're doing their audits of the rates.
State Corporation Commission.
Yes, the State Corporation Commission, when they're doing their audits of the rates, they'll be able to say, okay, you're overcharging, okay, you're undercharging, and it just keeps it more, it keeps Dominion more accountable, other utilities as well, and then it keeps things more transparent for customers.
And Dave, just to touch on that, with the huge wind project off of Virginia Beach, there was a recent resolution among the stakeholders of a way to try to tamp down on the performance. Can you explain that?
Sure. This goes back. The State Corporation Commission had really its hands were sort of tied as far as basically approving the project, which is quite expensive. It's like a $9 billion project. And so when they finally did, they had a performance standard. They said you had to be able to produce about I think it's 40-some% of what the rated capacity of this is.
Dominion had to with the wind project.
Right. Dominion said this was onerous because it's just getting started. Who knows? And in fact, Dominion was starting to talk about just pulling the project altogether. We had some negotiations where the performance standard went away, and instead, Attorney General Mayaris and some consumer groups negotiated a kind of agreement about cost overruns should the project end up costing more than $9 billion. And these would be, the initial overrun would fall on customers. After about $1 billion or so of overrun that way, it would be split Dominion and customers. And then after another $1 billion of that, Dominion would eat it.
And the general idea here is to try to minimize the effect on consumers if things don't go as planned for Dominion. Dominion has said, there could be acts of God. You could have a hurricane that damages things. You could have, God forbid, an act of terrorism. They want to be held harmless for things that they say would be beyond their control.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's sort of a meeting of the minds that there's a way to sort of protect consumers and protect Dominion at the same time.
I think there is. It's really interesting to me, and I know this is sort of inside baseball, that Dominion is talking about increased State Corporation Commission control. And the guy carrying this for Dominion is Terry Kilgore, the majority leader in the House, who has been one of the legislators who's been most active with Dominion's earlier program of loosening the hold of the SEC over rates.
Right. And Charlotte, you've been writing about some of the other legislative aspects related to Dominion and energy. What else is going on?
Yeah, so last month, a number of bills were filed that were very similar that would repeal the law that passed last year that put Virginia, kind of hitched us to the tailpipe emissions that California has. And the reason that California has this exception, it goes a little bit deeper than what the federal law allows for on emissions. And so that's why you see other states, I think Virginia is one of 16 or 17 that have decided, you know what, we're going to do what California is doing. Meanwhile, California is in the process of considering banning gas-powered cars by 2035, which obviously caused some Virginia legislators to go, whoa, wait a minute, do we really want to stay connected to this? So there's, a handful of bills to pull us out of that. Don't know how that will go. Again, we have a split-party control, and it's not totally partisan, but largely Democrats support that staying hitched to California's emission standards, while some Republicans say they want to, get out of that. It's sort of what we're seeing right now too. What we were talking about, authority between the Board of Education, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is colloquially known as RGGI. It's sort of a cap-and-trade market that is aimed at keeping emissions low. So the Virginia General Assembly put us into it, and the Youngkin administration has been saying he wants to pull us out of it, seeking a regulatory route. We will continue to see that debate play out throughout the year, even past General Assembly session, on how that's going to go and whose authority it actually is to stay in RGGI or get out of RGGI.
Yeah, we've seen several instances in which the governor, having been an executive in private industry, has tried to do some things through executive action, and the legislature has said, whoa, hold on a minute, that's the province of the legislature. So we're probably going to see some more debate about that as to who actually gets to make the decision as to whether Virginia should stay or leave the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And again, this is a group of about a dozen states that try to work together in the Northeast to try to put these caps on. Of course, everything that's going to transpire in the next 46 days is going to come in the context of looming elections in the fall, where we have all 140 legislative seats are going to be on the ballot. That's 40 seats in the state Senate and 100 seats in the House of Delegates. Right now, as Charlotte explained, we have sort of split dominion, to coin the phrase, in the legislature, where the Democrats, pending the result of tonight's special election, the Democrats have a 21-19 edge in the Senate, and the Republicans, pending the results of two special elections tonight, they have a 52-48 edge in the House of Delegates. So whatever happens in those fall elections is going to largely determine the outcome of Governor Youngkin's agenda. And so we won't belabor this too much, but that sort of plays into the will he or won't he discussion that's going on about Governor Youngkin.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And, it's going to set a lot of the tone for the session, too. We used to talk about something called brochure bills, which are bills that are introduced largely to be on election flyers in November. But seriously, Governor Youngkin is a first-term governor. There's a lot of speculation, which he's been sort of kind of putting a damper on, but a lot of speculation about national plans. For that to happen, of course, he's got to be an effective governor. He's got to get stuff through. And that would probably include things like, not this session, but after the election, the 24th session, things like abortion, which really do matter to the national Republican
And school
electorate.
choice as well.
And school choice as well.
Right.
So I think a big takeaway is, a lot of bills that are being introduced right now, they may or may not get traction this year, but it will keep the conversation going, and that will bleed into the elections that happen, the primaries this coming summer and the general election next fall, or this fall.
Speaking of the primaries this summer, that's going to be another fascinating thing to watch, because given the redistricting that occurred in late 2021, that was done not by folks aligned with parties, but it was done by the state Supreme Court, which didn't care who was representing which districts. So we've got a lot of incumbents who have sort of been paired in districts. So we're going to see some really fascinating nominating fights before we even get to the general election. So that's another thing to keep an eye on. So one other issue that I wanted to get to before we close out, this is something that's not a priority of the governor, who's keeping his hands off, but we have an important issue regarding casinos in the Richmond area. Dave, tell folks a little bit about what's going on there.
Well, Petersburg is really eager to build a casino. They're talking about, I think, a $1.4 billion casino over by 95. And State Senator Joe Morrissey has been pushing very hard to say Richmond, which had, you remember in 2021, voters narrowly rejected authorizing a casino here. Joe Morrissey wants to be sure that Richmond doesn't have another vote that while Petersburg is trying to set up its casino. The reason why is that Petersburg and its developer Cordish from Baltimore are really convinced that a casino there and a casino here would simply be too close together. The Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission says they could both be viable. You will remember that in Norfolk and Portsmouth, there are going to be casinos really right across the Elizabeth River. So it's...
And they would be in closer proximity than
Almost.
Richmond and Petersburg.
Yeah.
But Petersburg is pretty adamant that having the two so close together would be untenable.
Yeah, I think so. And so there's going to be a fight over, does Richmond get another crack at this? Does Senator Morrissey's effort to protect Petersburg's current lead on the casino race hold? And that kind of gets down to one senator's sway in the state legislature.
And Mayor Stoney of Richmond yesterday came out forcefully and reiterated that he's adamant that he wants Richmond to get a second crack at a casino after it narrowly failed in 2021. So that's one that is going to be of particular interest locally. One important state legislator, Janet Howell of Fairfax, has said she expects that to be, in her words, a brawl. So that's one to watch. So so there's a lot to watch in the session to come. And so I want to thank Charlotte Renee Woods, Dave Ress, and Anna Bryson for joining me here to share their expertise on what we're going to be covering. And so I'd encourage everyone to stay tuned to richmond.com and the Richmond Times-Dispatch for our coverage of the session. Thanks very much.